very fortunate to have a special lecture by our guest of honor, Professor MICHEAL WITZEL. He's a professor of Wales, professor of Sanskrit in the Harvard University, Boston, USA. Professor WITZEL needs no introduction to this world of scholars, of Indologists and Sanskrit scholars. He had his graduation, post-graduation in Germany. In Tübingen, University of Tübingen, he did his graduation and MA in the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. And he started his career in teaching way back in 1972 as assistant professor of Indology at Tübingen, and later on at the University of Leiden at Netherlands. He was a visiting professor earlier in the Harvard University for 1 year, and from 1987 onwards, he has been occupying the much decorated seat of the Wales Professor of Sanskrit at the Harvard University. He has been doing pioneering work in Vedic studies, and he has been a driving force in many of the high-level committees in Nepal, in Kyoto, in Paris. He has been the founder editor of the Indo-Iranian Journal and the Harvard Oriental series, and he has done a lot of work on the comparative mythology. And it is really our very good fortune that Professor MICHEAL WITZEL has found time to join as a special invited guest of honor and to deliver a lecture on the historicity of the Vedas. Now I request Professor MICHEAL WITZEL to please present his special lecture. Professor WITZEL.
Namaskaram. I'm very happy to be with you in Kerala again, if only virtually. I remember very well the stay at the Atiratra Amichayana in 2011, and then the International Vedic Workshop in 2014. So I'm happy to continue in this fashion at least. So thank you very much for your invitation, especially Professor Murali Madhavan. And now I will proceed to my PowerPoint. I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Just a second.
We can see.
Yes, thank you. I just missed the. Something is interfering, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, as I say in the introduction, I will talk about the historicity of the Veda, and the subtitle is a multidisciplinary approach, because this is, I think, what we need. Because the historicity of the Veda, or the actual existence of the Vedas, has been denied by some, because for millennia the Vedas have only been transmitted orally and in writing only for the last 1,000 years or so. And others, of course, have pushed back the Veda to 3102 or even earlier. So we have two different positions. So I will try to navigate between these, and will use multidisciplinary evidence for the early texts, that is especially the Ṛgveda, around 1200 BCE. More about that later on. Because of that, of course, my talk will not be looked at favorably by the intellectual and political left. For instance, the case of the river Saraswati, which is doubted by some, and while it is clearly mentioned in the river hymn of Ṛgveda book 10, and certainly also not by the right, and also not by traditional Pandits, if they don't venture out of their books. However, extremely well they study these texts. So I'm, as we say in German, I'm sitting between all the chairs here. So my aim is to find out, to distill what is actually contained in the Vedas based on a multidisciplinary approach. More about that in a minute. Of course, since I actually am a student of Indology or Indian studies, especially the Vedas, I cannot be a specialist in the various sciences from archaeology to zoology. But I must say we have tried to have an interdisciplinary approach in our yearly roundtables at Harvard for 15 odd years between the textual study, linguistics, archaeology, and also genetics. And I've tried to keep up with that. So here I will present some of those data. So as I say, we need a multidisciplinary approach from those fields. They must be examined critically, as I said, by interdisciplinary dialogue. I have 2 or 3 preliminary points, since the term Arya is very much discussed and disputed. In India, we usually speak of Aryans, but Arya is actually the self-designation of Iranians and, let us say, Northern Indians, Vedic Indians. They call themselves Arya. For instance, the Persian King Darius in 519 BCE wrote in his Bestun inscription, "I'm the first to write in Arya," because other inscriptions are in Mesopotamian languages. So secondly, Arya is of course not a racial term, but a cultural one in the Veda, that is. And it is a linguistic term by which the linguists define Vedic Sanskrit, Old Persian, the Zoroastrian Avesta, and they are all Indo-Iranian languages. Interestingly, as a footnote, Arya is usually not used in the Veda to designate the Vedic language, the early form of Sanskrit, if you like. Only once in Aranyaka we get Arya Vak, the Aryan speech. Then another preliminary is dates and data. The major problem is, of course, the date of the early Arya texts, especially the Ṛgveda. Secondly, the archaeology of Northwest India, let us say the Greater Punjab, after the end of the Indus or Harappan civilization around 1900, 1300 BCE, we have no data for the Vedic texts in archaeology. So the Harappan civilization ended just before what we call the Indo-Aryan migration into northwestern India. Of course, India used in the traditional sense, including Pakistan, India, and so on. Now, if we combine textual data from the Ṛgveda, etc., and linguistic data, more about that in a second, we can indicate a beginning of the Ṛgvedic period around 1200 BCE. Nowadays, more detailed genetic data, especially ancient DNA, sustain these results. Here already you can see various sciences come together at the same location and date. So the data from the various sciences will now be presented, but always with cross-references to the other sciences and text, which indicate overlaps and even confirmations. Of course, each field has its own problems, and I cannot go much into that today because my talk is already too long, I'm afraid. So let us start with archaeology. By the way, if you have a question, you could perhaps ask the organizers for this PowerPoint and receive it from them. Now, first archaeology. So the Great Indus, or as we call it technically, the Harappan civilization from its heyday from 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era, and with some late Indus remnants until 1300 BCE. But that does not overlap, as you can see already, with the Vedic text. And so the Harappan civilization is definitely pre-Vedic, although that is disputed by many people, especially on the political right now. Now, the actual Vedic data, if we could find them in the Greater Punjab, they are rare because there are some 5 meters of sediments on top of this early period. So you have to dig deep and you have to find the place, which is a problem. Nowadays, with modern technology, we can perhaps do so, but there are many more interesting areas, especially in westernmost Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan, and they are little explored and, of course, now mostly inaccessible. Then secondly, most North Indian, the post-Harappan, so to speak, Vedic excavations are badly reported. This is well known among the archaeologists. I don't need to go into detail, but mostly with old-style pottery data, which give you a relative chronology, but not correct dates. More recently, of course, we have others like the C14 methods, or the use of tree rings, the dendrochronology, and so on. So we get a more accurate dating for whatever we find in archaeological excavations. Sorry. The problem is that of the late Harappan period, so that means up to 1300 BCE roughly, we have very little excavations, and mainly in the town of Harappa. So what we can see is that the style of pottery is maintained, but with some new designs and with a shift to cremation and subsequent urn burial. So this, interestingly, there is a motif of a little human being inside a bird, which may reflect the Vedic ideas that the ancestors fly around for 1 year in the form of birds. So there are some more, and I will cut it short. There are more excavations of graveyards, but unfortunately not with DNA, as we can see. So there are interesting burials and remains at Sinauli, that is just east of Delhi on the Yamuna River. Allegedly, we don't have clear dates from 1800 or 2000 BCE. So that would mean the last stage of the Harappan civilization before the migration of Indo-Aryans into the Greater Punjab. So we don't get a good overlap between the Indus and the Vedic period, rather they are quite different from each other. Now I will give you one example of interpretation of such, sorry, what is going on, of such archaeological data. And that is because the people on the right, Hindu tribe people especially, they constantly contest such data. Interestingly, they proceed just in the manner of Christian fundamentalists. We have a good experience of that in the America here, by exploring disagreements between individual scholars. Of course, scholars always disagree with each other, but this is then taken to indicate that the subject would and could not provide reliable results. Instead, they always put forth alternative facts, another current US term, and imagined dates reaching back far into the early Bronze Age or even to the beginning of Kali Yuga and so on, some even earlier. So as an example of archaeological finds in the interpretation, I will discuss the question of horses and chariots. So horses are steppe animals, they don't occur in the desert areas. Yeah? There we get donkeys and onagers, or as we call them in India, half-asses. Yeah? So these are still remnant in Gujarat, in the run of Kutch actually. But horses are fairly late import into South Asia and also into the Near East, around 1900, 1700. And therefore in India too, early horse bones and figurines are attested from 1800 onwards. And that they can be due to pre-Indo-Aryan migration of people at that date. Similarly in Mesopotamia, actually. So if you read reports about Indus horses, you better take them with so many grains of salt, because skeletons of horses, half-asses, onagers, and donkeys can only be distinguished by their phalanges. That is, on our hand, you know, the various bones in our fingers. So when you have them, then you can see whether this skeleton is one of a horse or a donkey, etc. But we don't have good specimens yet in collections of data. Now, the earliest horse finds, as I mentioned just now, may not even belong to the speakers of Indo-Aryans. That is quite similar in Mesopotamia, where we have early horse finds among non-Indo-Iranian or Indo-Aryan people. Secondly, we must restate what a chariot actually is. Yeah? It was a lightweight, about 30 kilogram, horse-drawn vehicle with 2 spoked wheels and mounted by 1 or 2 riders, Sanskrit Ratin or Ratesta. So that is not the case in the recent finds of so-called chariots at Sinauli, as I mentioned, east of Delhi. These are carts with full wheels, with bronze ornaments, and probably drawn by bullock, like the massive Daimabad bronze race cart found in Maharashtra, I think. So let me see. Yeah, so this is a picture of the excavation. You can see here the full wheel, and in the reconstruction it is clearer. So this is not what we would call a chariot, but people use this term even for the Bhubaneswar large vehicle, you see, the Jagannath vehicle. So we should be very clear when we speak of chariots. They should rather look like, oh, sorry, this is a Daimabad bullock cart. You can see it's not drawn by horses, but by bullocks with full wheels. So I will not go into much detail now. The chariots seem to have been invented in the Ural area in eastern Russia. Both the Indo-Iranian terms, Ratha for chariot and driver, Ratin, or Ratarishta in Indo-Iranian, were invented in that area around 2000 BCE. And from there then imported into the Near East, Egypt, in the early to middle 2nd millennium BC. And similar, of course, in India. Yeah, we find, as I mentioned, we don't find them before 1800 or so. So here we have a grave at Sintashta in the Ural area. You see, this is still a proto-chariot with a full wheel, while later on, the spoked wheel is invented. It is clearly visible here in the so-called Oxus treasure. Unfortunately, it has been in St. Petersburg for 200 years or so. We don't know exactly from where it comes, and of course not from which level. But you can see you have 2 people there, the driver and the passenger, so to speak. So, so much for the background and interpretation of certain features in archaeology. Now, when we look around for possible remnants of Indo-Aryans in India, we can look at the Gandhara grave culture, or the Iron Age, so a little later, the Iron Age excavation at Accra in Bannu, that is westernmost Pakistan, around 1000 BCE. So this Iron Age, while the Ṛgveda is still Bronze Age. But here we get stone fortresses like those of the chieftain Sambala in the Ṛgveda, who, according to the Ṛgveda, could not be overcome for 40 years with his 99, that means a lot of fortresses. So it is a good example of the overlap between text, archaeology, and linguistic, because the name Shambhala is not Indo-Aryan. Here is an overview of the Andronovo culture, to which Sintashta belongs in Kazakhstan, Eastern Russia, and so on, and which will return to the BMSC later on. That's the Bactria Magyana culture, and Swat here with the earliest Indo-Aryan genes, as we'll see. So we need much more archaeology, especially in areas that are not covered by these 5 meters of sediment. So in places which are higher, above the ancient floodplain. That has not been done. But now penetrating satellite data and drones, of course, may help us to identify the shallow pastoral remnants of the of the Indo-Aryans who moved around in their territory from one grazing area to the next. I will not go into this scenario here of how people move from the Ural area to India. Usually we think across the rivers here in Central Asia, but there's also the mountain corridor with very good grazing pasture land. And actually this is still inhabited by the Kyrgyz today, all the way from Kyrgyzstan down to northern Kashmir. So let us come to linguistics then. And that, by that I mean comparative historical linguistics. This is again very much discussed now by revisionists, but they usually don't have any insight into the aims and methods. But still, usually, as you can see below, denounce this science as a colonial pseudoscience. Well, actually, this kind of linguistic comparison works very well in Africa or Polynesia or the Americas. So why not in India? Yeah? So, but people who attack comparative linguistics, of course, don't know anything about the other fields. Yeah? So as far as our Indo-European languages are concerned, you see here the Indo-Iranian languages in blue, from Kurdish to Assamese, and of course, Sinhala in Sri Lanka as well. And I won't go into details here. Germanic languages in red and so on, Slavic language in green. And we should cut off here near the Urals because the rest is very late expansion of Russian. So we get a family tree like this here, with Indo-Iranian in the middle here, branching off into Iranian and, as they say here, Sanskrit. So comparative linguistics is a natural science as far as the sounds of the language are concerned. Yeah, they can be measured scientifically, both for their frequency and the position of where they are produced in the mouth or in the larynx, etc. Meanings is a more complicated thing, but my standard example is always English hound and dog, which corresponds exactly to German Hund and Dogge, but the German Hund is a dog and the German Dogge is a bloodhound, so exactly opposite. Huh? So we can, of course, deduce from this that these words mean some kind of dog, if we don't have other evidence. So apart from Indo-European, that means Indo-Aryan languages in India, we have, first I have to tell those who doubt the validity of historical and comparative linguistics, we actually have the proof of the pudding. For instance, two sounds, one in Hittite, the ancient language of Turkey, and one in early pre-Homeric Greek. That is the sound laryngeal H2 and the Greek K. They have been reconstructed already in the 19th century, but they were actually discovered in writing only in the earliest 20th century, 1916 and 48, by the Czech scientist Hrozny and the British Ventris. So here you have the sounds represented in writing, which had been reconstructed 100 years earlier, but without any written evidence. So most North Indian languages, and Sinhala, of course, belong to this group of Indo-Iranian, or rather Indo-Aryan, and ultimately Indo-European languages. Similar reconstruction, of course, we find for Dravidian and for the Munda languages, Austroasiatic that is, and Tibeto-Burman as well in the Himalayas, Assam, and so on. So I will just briefly mention that there are certain remnant languages, even in the area where Indo-Aryan is spoken. For instance, Burushaski in the northernmost Pakistan on the Chinese border, Kusunda in the hills of Nepal, Nahali in central India, where about 25% of its vocabulary are neither Indo-Aryan nor Dravidian nor Munda, and they are the oldest Indian vocabulary, so to speak. And the Veda in Sri Lanka as well, and certainly whatever is left of the Andamanese languages in the Andaman Islands. So these are remnants of languages that are neither Indo-Aryan nor Dravidian nor Munda. There are many extinct languages, substrates, we would call them, with usually easily identifiable by unusual sounds, grammar, no Indo-Aryan, etc., etymology. For instance, one is the one in substrate in Hindi by Masika, a professor at Chicago, where he studied agricultural terms. But when I looked more closely at this, they're actually found from, let us say, northern Pakistan all the way to Marathi and so on. Unfortunately, this kind of study, substrate studies, is not found in India. Yeah? We don't have any investigations of what may lie below Hindi or Sindhi. And the same is true, of course, for Dravidian languages. Yeah, so one of my colleagues, actually Blazek, in the Czech Republic, he found an Australian residue in Tamil. As we have seen when we come to genetics, the native, the Aboriginal Australians, of course, came all the way from Africa via India to Australia. And apparently there's some residue of that found in Tamil, also in genetics, by the way. So we get a very long prehistory of Indian languages for some 60,000 years from the initial immigration from Africa. And we get many linguistic data sets, and we can certainly say with confidence that there never was a single or even dominant language of ancient South Asia, and also not for the area of the Indus or Harappan civilization. Here you get a map of some of these major and remnant languages. We can discuss in detail the migration path. Of course, I assume that the speakers of Indo-Aryan, so early Sanskrit, if you wish, have come from the steppes of Kazakhstan and Russia into the greater Punjab. Now, the Ṛgveda itself is clearly a South Asian text. We can see that by the many river names mentioned, especially in the river hymn of Ṛgveda 1075, for instance, the Sindhu for the Indus, the Krumu for the current Kulam river in Pakistan, the Gomati for the Gomal river in Pakistan, Vipash for the Bias, Yamuna for the current Jamna, and so on and so on. So clearly, this is an area from roughly Delhi or even the Ganga all the way into eastern Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan, with the Kabul River, etc. That is the Kubha in Sanskrit. And one of them is, of course, the Saraswati River, which I've not mentioned here, which is clearly located between the Yamuna and the Vipash, so in the eastern Punjab or Haryana. That is a note for those who, who doubt the existence of the river Saraswati, which is a very small rivulet nowadays. So for the spread southwards, we can see we have many types of evidence from the Bactrian area, the BMAC, and from the mountain belt and from the Hindu Kush, etc. The interesting point here, and I have to be very brief here, is that we get many Indo-Iranian or Indo-Aryan loanwords in various Uralic languages. That Uralic is Finnish, Hungarian, Estonian, and languages in northern Russia like Komi and so on. So these languages have absorbed quite a few words from even Indo-Iranian. So early on, from about 2000 BCE, for instance, we have the god Bhaga, which turns up as Pakas. So even with the nominative S nowadays, of course, with Sardinian. So Pakaha, Bhagaha, so turns up out as the older form Bhagas, and in Uralic as Pakas, or Sata for 100. Interestingly, Orja in Finnish for an Aryan slave, so apparently some Indo-Aryans were caught by the Uralic people. Chakra with the old form of, with the K still in existence as Kekre, and so on and so on. So there are many studies of Indo-Iranian loanwords and in the Uralic languages. Yeah. Why? Because the Indo-Iranian culture was more developed than those in the mountains of the Ural and beyond for the Uralic tribes. So after the Indo-Aryans left south, the remaining Iranians, Proto-Iranians, supplied a large amount of loanwords to the Uralic languages and even to Slavic. For instance, the Iranian Baga, that is from Sanskrit Bhaga, becomes Slavic Bogu for God. Yeah, you can still in Russian, you can still Bože moj, oh my God, yeah? And nobody knows that this is Sanskrit Bhaga. And the river names like Don, Dnieper, Dniester, Danube, etc., all for a word like Danu for a river or the goddess of that. So one important point here is that we actually have early Indo-Aryan, not Iranian, not Indo-Iranian, but early Indo-Aryan, that means basically Vedic words in the Mitanni kingdom, which is a kingdom in northern Syria and northern Iraq from roughly 1600 onwards. And they have quite different types of words taken over into their non-Indo-European language. Horse colors. There's a horse training manual with terms for 1 turn, 2 turn, 3 turns, 5 turns, etc. Aika Vartana, Tri Vartana, and so on. The chariot fighters are called Maria with the nu suffix of the Mitanni language. There is an agreement between the Mitannis and their neighbors in Turkey, the Hittites, which mention at the end, the very end, 4 major Vedic gods in this order: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, and Nasatya, that means the Ashwin. And finally, there are many royal names, because when a king of the Mitannis assumed power, he took on an Indo-Aryan name. We sometimes know his original Mitanni name, but as a throne name, he took on an Indo-Aryan term. So they are attested even from Palestine all the way to eastern Iraq. So this is a picture of the Mitanni realm and their neighbor here, the Hittites. And by the way, in the southern Iraq, we have the Kassites, which also are non-Indo-European, but they have a lot of the same type of Indo-Aryan loanwords. Why do I mention this at great length? Because these words provide us a date for the Ṛgveda. So here we have an overlap between linguistics and actually written text, archaeology, if you like. We know that the Ṛgveda is a late Bronze Age text before iron was introduced around 1000 BCE in the Punjab, earlier in some other parts of India. Now, when we look at the Indo-Aryan words in Mitanni documents, they're slightly older than the Ṛgveda. For instance, in the word Mazda, which becomes Iranian Mazda, we have this combination of az, which turns into e in Sanskrit, in the Ṛgveda, Medira, and so on. So this is an older form written down in the Mitanni text, and so it must be several hundred years earlier than our Ṛgveda. And the same is found in verb forms for the perfect, for instance, sede, he has sat down, etc., which would have been sazdai. Avesta still has hazde. And this this change from az to e, I mean, if you have a verb sad, why should be the perfect in e? Yeah, there's no reason. But here we can see, or mene, yeah? But here we can see that it comes from a sazdai. And this process of changing roots with middle a is still in progress in the Ṛgveda. For instance, as I said, from man you get mene and so on. In some, the Ṛgveda cannot be much older than 1400 BCE, and it may not be much older than 1200 BCE, because by 1400 you still had Sazdai or Mazda, but in the Ṛgveda you have Med, yeah, and Sede, and so on. So it's a very good point where archaeology overlaps with the linguistic data. Therefore, some details here. Now, how the actual migration paths, for instance, for the Mitanni Indo-Aryans took place, that is up for discussion. The word for money, for jewel, may point to a migration from Tajikistan, the Tajikistan area. So then from 13th century BCE, we get a transition to mountain cattle breeding and an increase in riding skills, which are sparsely attested. Mostly we get chariots, and about 5 times we get evidence for horse riding. So there's a book by the Russian scholar, the late Kuzmina, where you can find details about that. So again, there is the move to the Greater Punjab and Afghanistan by the speakers of early Iranian and Ṛgvedic. And as you can see, the Mitanni are way off in the west, in the Mesopotamian area. So as I mentioned, this mountain belt has very good pastures above 1000 meters, and that is exactly the territory still occupied by the Kyrgyz people from Kyrgyzstan to Kashmir. And this is, we can locate some of this because in the Ṛgveda, the mountain Mujavand is the mountain where we get the best Soma. And in Avesta, so in the Zoroastrian text, we get the Muja person and the Muja land. It still can be found in modern topography, as I noticed some 10 or 15 years ago, to my surprise, because we still have the Muj Tar Ata mountain and the Muj Kol river. That is now in Kyrgyz, And the Mush is still there, but Tar is the mountain, Atta means father. So this in their language, it means the ice mountain father. But the Mush is still preserved from Ṛgvedic and Avestan times onward. So this is exactly the area where the Indo-Iranians, both the Iranians and the Vedic Indians, picked up the Soma drink. More about that later on. So there are a number of loanwords from the Bactria area, which Lubotsky in Holland has studied in 2003. And surprisingly, he lists names like Indra, Atharva, Gandharva, Sarva, and so on. Among these, the word for brick is very interesting, Ishti. In the Ṛgveda, we don't get any bricks, but it is found all over Iranian and in the Dardic area and Burushaski as well. And interestingly, in Tocharian, that means westernmost China, yeah, the Xinjiang area. We find Ishti and Ishtika after the Ṛgveda. So apart from such words, we get some influence from the ancient Near East. When agriculture, that means wheat agriculture, spread to the borders of India. The word for wheat is very strange in Sanskrit. It is godhuma, which means cow smoke. Why should anybody call a plant cow smoke? Well, it is an adaptation with a popular etymology into Sanskrit, because the East Iranian form is gantuma, and the Caucasus we get gomu and such words. So it's all from the Near Eastern word khand. Similarly, for donkey, where we get Avestan and Vedic words. There's some evidence also from the Hindu Kush area. For instance, the word for crystal, studied long ago by one of my teachers, Karl Hoffman, and that needs much more research, yeah, which words in the Hindu Kush area have entered into Indo-Aryan. I would especially like to point out the Nagas. They are well attested in the Afghan and northwestern Indian area, but usually connected with ice and snow. They reside in lakes, ponds, and rivers, and also in frozen lakes. This is not what an Indian Naga is like, you see, but they are shape-shifting, just like the Indian Nagas. So the main river of Afghanistan in that area is called Lunam. That means Deva Naga. So this is some idea of how it looks in that area. That is northwestern Pakistan. The Kalasha people who have a pseudo, kind of Vedic religion until this day, so being surrounded by Muslims on all sides. And finally, there are a lot of loanwords, of course, from the northern Indus area, about 300 of them. The interesting point, they have been studied by my predecessor, Kuiper in Holland, at great length, last in his book of 1991, which is misnamed Aryans in the Ṛgveda. The non-Aryans got lost in the phone transmission. So the book is called Aryans in Ṛgveda, while the book is about non-Aryans in the Ṛgveda. Now, the interesting point here is that the oldest loans in the Ṛgveda, before book 10, for example, are not from Dravidian or Proto-Dravidian. I call them Paramunda, which would be a long discussion because they share some Munda traits, but not all of them. So it is an unknown language with unusual sounds. For instance, letters like sh after a and a, which is just not done in Sanskrit. Or an s found after e and u, again non-Indo-Aryan. And we can go on the particle iti and absolutives, gatva, etc. Samgam, which are not Dravidian, as my friend Kelper thought, because they are also found in Burushaski and Munda. So it is a South Asian feature. So, and clearly an aerial feature. Yeah, all languages which passed through this area of the Dardic Indo-Aryan language, like Kalasha, the Burushaski area in northern Pakistan, eastern Iranian, and Pashto in Afghanistan, and even on the northern side in Xinjiang, Saka, Khotani Saka, Iranian. So they all have developed this retroflex sound, ter, der, ner, sh, etc. Kalasha even has a retroflex u. Try to speak u with your tongue bent backwards. So this is clearly an aerial feature of the Northwest, let us say, and it has not been recognized. So it is accepted even by late immigrants like Baluchi from Turkey. The Western Baluchi don't have it. The Eastern Baluchi on the Indian side have retroflexes, so you can acquire it. It is something probably very old, but I won't go there. The important point here about the type of loanwords in the Ṛgveda and later Vedic texts is that they don't reflect the Indus or Harappan civilization. Yeah. Why? Because the Indo-Aryans moved into that area only after the Indus period, the Indus civilization disintegrated. But some people, of course, remain in the greater Punjab, and they are in close communication with the Indo-Aryans. So those words enter into Ṛgvedic speech, especially agriculture, plants, some wild animals, terms for music and dance, not the great Harappan deities, but low-level spirits and demons. Those we find in the Ṛgveda. So clearly some kind of communication was going on with the post-Harappan people and the Indo-Aryans. Of course, in Indo-Aryan, you have all the old Indo-European designations for horse, cattle, and so on. The interesting point is that even some of the local leadership is integrated, as we can see in the Ṛgveda, for instance, the chieftain Bribhu or Balbhuta. I must add here that B is a very rare sound in Indo-European and also in early Indo-Aryan, of course. And so if you get chieftains called Bribhu, that is not an Indo-Aryan person, but he is a recognized chieftain among the Ṛgvedic tribes. And similarly, interestingly, also for early poets, for instance, in the battle hymn, Ṛgveda 7:18, you get the poet Kavasha with a sh after sound ah, which is not allowed in Indo-Aryan. It is after eu, etc., but not after ah. And the same is true for the retroflex n, Kanva, book 8 of the Ṛgveda, where we have retroflex n after a again. So these two poets, they have typical non-Indo-Aryan names, which shows that some of the local population was integrated into Ṛgvedic society and even became Ṛgvedic poets. So all of that, of course, came to a certain halt with the codification of the 4 classes, Varna, not castes, but classes, in the late Ṛgveda in 1090, in the Purusha Sukta, where we have Brahmana, Rajanya for Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra. As I said, the high-level deities of the Harappan civilization don't appear, and most of the other typical traits of Harappan civilization don't appear in the Ṛgveda, like trade and seals and so forth. So the Ṛgvedic loans were taken from the post-Harappan rural population which remained. So as I mentioned, some loan words in the late Ṛgveda are from Dravidian, but not, as most people think, from Proto-Tamil, because those loan words start with d or g, etc., which is not a Tamil feature. Yeah? For the lizard, for example, you get Gauli, not Kauli, and so on. So this is similar to Kannada, or in this case, we should think perhaps about the predecessor of Kannada. But that is a term, point which has not been studied at all, actually. So I leave the question when Dravidians actually appeared in India. They must have come ultimately, of course, via Iran from Africa, but these are the ancestors of Dravidian speakers. Dravidian itself is, of course, a feature of the Mid-East and South Asia. And importantly, we can see about the Dravidian migration that place names are still found in Sindh and Maharashtra, way down to Middle Ages, which are clearly Dravidian and not Indo-Aryan. So we see the path of migration through Sindh and Maharashtra to what is now Dravidian territory in South India. Now, interestingly, we can study, for the southern Indus civilization, we could study the substrate in the Sindhi language. Then we would know what the major languages were from Sindh to Punjab, but that has not been done. We are now trying that at Harvard, and with interesting results, I can already say that some of the words are clearly pre-Indo-Aryan and go back to similar words in Masika's language, Exla. Interestingly, I should mention in passing at least, the name of the fourth class, the Sudra. They may go back to a Sindh substratum, because when Alexander and his scientists came to India in 326 BC, they noticed the Sudroi, or nowadays Greek Sudroi, people on the borders of Sindh and Punjab. So this may be one of the many cases where a tribal name was expanded to include other groups. For instance, since I'm from Germany, Germani is just one tribe. At the time Caesar went to the river Rhine around 45, I think, BC, and that has been expanded to all Germanic people like English and Scandinavian, etc. Another term is Mleta for barbaric tribes. It may also go back to the population of the lower Indus, because the Mesopotamians know of this area as Melucha and Pali Milaku. So how you get from Melucha to Mleta is, of course, a mystery. Mleta occurs, I think, for the first time in Satapatha Brahmana. Now we come to the field of genetics. That is a fairly recent entry into our discussion about the historicity of the Vedic text. So far, this branch of population genetics was based on modern genetic features, so genetic features taken from the current populations of India, for example, both for the female mtDNA and the male Y chromosome, NRY. They gave us some kind of dates, but they have very broad error bars. Like in archaeology before dendrochronology, etc., we get rough dates, but cannot really distinguish centuries, sometimes even millennia. So that was not very useful, although the data points from both parents helped a little bit. So beyond the female and the male DNA. So this is the path of migration out of Africa via India. Unfortunately, below the ocean nowadays, because the sea was 100 meters lower in those early years, up to Australia, where modern humans appear in 50,000 BCE. But now we have a sort of revolution in genetic studies. Some 10 years ago, we could actually investigate ancient DNA taken from skeletons, and especially from the inner ear, which tell us which history the population in a certain area had in great detail. For instance, Europeans and East Asians, but not Africans, have 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA, yeah, which we never knew before. And there are many others in Central Asia and beyond Indonesia, which are other types of early humans, and they have interacted with our ancestors, so to speak. So this is a burgeoning field of studies, and it is very important for us as far as the Vedic civilization is concerned. So far, we did not have any ancient DNA from Indian, Pakistani, etc. skeletons. Only modern DNA. But the reason is, of course, that the monsoon climate hinders the preservation of DNA, so it decays fairly quickly. And if you are lucky, you could find it in the petrous bone in the inner ear. But even that had not been done. So far, we just did not have ancient DNA from India. By the way, there's a new study now of ancient DNA, which we can trace in the soil of caves, etc. So that is a promising field. It is just a few months old. And so we know from normal DNA studies that there are two branches in India, the ancient North and the ancient South Indians, which does not mean Indo-Aryans and does not mean Dravidians, because this is much too early for that. So my colleagues in the Harvard Medical School, after a long discussion with them, they chose these terms just to avoid the confusions with Aryans and Dravidians. So we can study these DNA remnants in modern DNA. And I won't go into detail here. You can see that they come from various areas. For us, the male R1A is especially interesting because that is from Central Asia, important as we will see. So the expansion of this group R1A has occurred about, around 2000 BCE. And that coincides with the earliest entry of steppe people into South Asia, according to archaeology. But the case becomes even more interesting because now we have one skeleton from the Indus town of Ṛgveda, on westernmost India, I mean, current India. And immediately the newspapers broadcasted that this skeleton has no Aryan, no steppe DNA. So there's no Aryan invasion, as they say. So it becomes a political term, and there were quite a number of newspaper articles which pushed that line. But now we have a study by Vagesh Narasimhan, who was also at the Harvard Medical School, and he studied the earliest Central Asian DNA in India, that is in Swat, now in westernmost part of Pakistan. So you can find it, it has been published now, this is the early pre-publication. So the interesting point here is that some people entered into the Swat area, Sanskrit Vedic Suvastu, the good land, around 1250 BCE. That would be the first Indian ancient DNA, and interestingly from the steppe belt. And actually this is preserved in northern India among the Brahmins, especially up to 57%, or with the Kalasha up to 30%. So here for the first time we can see who entered India at what time and from where. This of course fits very nicely in time and space, linguistics and archaeology, the migration of Indo-Aryan speakers as we find them in the Ṛgveda. So this is one of the several cases of overlap between various sciences for which we should always look. to confirm our individual data. So I think this is so well established now with this SWOT evidence that we can be sure that this migration happened at this time. And whatever is said about no Indo-Aryan migration or invasion to South Asia is just contradicted by such evidence. And of course, there's no migration from, as some nationalists say, from India to the West, yes, all the way to Europe. Yeah. So some people say the Drukyu in the Ṛgveda are a European tribe nowadays. Well, luckily not, because Druk is, of course, from to cheat. Now, so the ancient DNA is a quickly expanding field now, and we can correlate it very nicely with other fields like linguistics and archaeology. Now, a little bit about Ṛgvedic religion, myth, and ritual, and I have to be short here, not to talk for too long. Of course, religion and ritual can be adopted very quickly, as you can see in any migrant population, for instance, here in America. But rituals can also be very archaic and change very little. For instance, as I mentioned, the Agni Chayana, which we witnessed in 2011 in Kerala, they go back some 3,000 years and based on Vedic texts are still being performed in the same fashion. Yeah. So there are films about that by Fritz Stahl from 1975 onwards. Yeah, if we compare the Ṛgvedic Indo-Aryan text with the Harappan civilization, the Indus civilization, you can see that there is no continuation. Yeah. The great deities of the Indus are not found in the Vedic text, only some low-level deities and spirits, demons, Shishnadeva, etc. But many words like Chimedian and so on, they are isolated linguistically and belong to the substrate. They are not Indo-Aryan. And the link of the Harappan civilization with later Hinduism, thousands of years and sometimes thousands of kilometers distant, is of course a fantasy, especially propagated by our colleague Parpola. So for instance, the famous Shiva Pashupati seal, I think I have it here, yeah, this one. It does not reflect the later Shiva, but it is a very widespread Stone Age Northern Eurasian deity, the Lord of the Animals, which is found, for example, on a vessel in Western Denmark, in Gundestrup. You can see it here, at least to some extent. So figures surrounded by three animals with their heads in one direction, one animal the other direction. And the animals have changed a little bit in Europe. You see, you don't get the tiger and so on. And the person here, Kernunos, as we call him in Celtic, has trousers, which you don't need in the Indus here. So the same for Mahishasura killing. The Indus seal has it like this here, while usually the Asura is killed from the back in the later Indian civilization. And I like this one. The Namaste gesture is found already in Bactria Magyana around 2000 BCE. So it is not a Vedic invention, it is earlier than that. And to my great surprise, I found it in Japan as well, around 1000 BCE. So this is something, again, which is quite old and not necessarily Indian. So as far as the deities are concerned, the Veda has, of course, many remnants of Indo-European religion and ritual: Father Heaven, Mother Earth, the Daughter of Heaven, Ushas, the Sons of Heaven, the Ashwins, and so on, and especially the fire worship, Agni, Latin Ignis, etc. Also, one of the major deities, that is Indra, and his function as dragon slaying, which we find in many Indo-European cultures, Greek and Iranian and so forth, is also found in Nuristan, so easternmost Afghanistan, and with the Kalasha people in westernmost Pakistan. He still is called Indra there. Yeah? Ancestor worship is another item. You always worship, you always offer for your 3 ancestors. So therefore, Greek Trito, Patros, the 3 ancestors. And many of the domestic rituals or Grisha rituals you can find here and there in the Indo-European areas, but they are well collected in the Grisha Sutra text in India. A different story refers to the sacred drink. In the Indo-European culture, it was fermented honey, English mead, or Sanskrit madhu, and that is the drink of immortality, Greek ambrosia, which means amrita. So this is something which is not transmitted into the Iranian and Vedic religion. Instead, we have the sacred drink Soma, a Western Homa, from the word su, to press out. It is most probably the plant ephedra, which you get in many cold medicines, ephedra sinica, etc. And in both the Ṛgvedic tradition and the Greek tradition, this is brought by an eagle from the high mountain, as we will see. So, of course, mead and ambrosia are sweet, but the Soma is rather bitter, but it is still called sweet in the Ṛgveda. So you have to add milk, etc., to make it drinkable. So we have a very elaborate ritual around the Soma ritual, both on the Iranian side and the Indian side. And it's, of course, still performed, as we have seen in Kerala, or you can see every year in Kerala, and by the Zoroastrians of Yazd Kerman in Iran, and of course the Parsis in Mumbai. So they still have the Soma ritual, although it has changed to metal implements. And many of the Soma ritual terms are again non-Indo-Aryan, like Chamu, Chamrish, etc. Now, we can locate the origin. Here is the Kerala ritual, with the Soma offerings. That is 2011 in this case. Now, this is the Central Asian innovation. We have one word for Soma is Anshu, Sanskrit Anshu, a Western Anshu, Tokaran Ensuan, Tokaran again in westernmost China, and even in Chinese. So the best Soma comes from the mountain Mujavand. It is called Maujavata in the Ṛgveda. This is a clear, striking mountain of some 500 meters in westernmost China in Xinjiang. And as I mentioned earlier, it is still called Muj. The Avesta has a Muja land. It's clearly on the borders of Iran and India, because the local person mentioned from the Muja land is called Dashta Agni. But Agni is not an Iranian term. It is substituted by the Zoroastrian term Atar. So here we have a borderland of India and Iran. And as I mentioned, it is still to be found with the Muj mountain in Xinjiang and Kashmir. So these items, non-Indo-European items, were brought into India by the migrant Indo-Aryans. So this is the Muj Tar Atta in Xinjiang from the new Karakoram highway from Pakistan into Xinjiang. You can actually go there. Try to find the Soma on this mountain. Then, to be brief, there are certain survivals of Indo-European institutions, like the 3 classes, priests, nobility, and the people, Vish, Vaishya. But in India and also with the Greeks, the 4th class was added, the Shudra, or Pan-Hellenes in essence. Another important item is the Young Men's Association, the sodality. So teenagers had to prove themselves either by territorial expansion. The north term we use landnama, the taking of land, and by some rituals, including in Greece, the killing of a helot, so a low-class person. So these young men are dressed up like wolves. Yeah, there we get the werewolf motif, and they're playing a dice game with dog knuckles in Greek and Latin. And this has actually recently been discovered in a Russian excavation where this was done with parts of dog skulls. So these people are called vratyas in Sanskrit. They occur in the prose text of Atharvaveda, book 15. They have always been misunderstood to this very day, but if you want to read about it, you can read a book by Falk, 1986, where he clearly shows that these young men, they are basically Veda students on spring leave. And just like our students, they go to interesting places and behave obnoxiously. So also here, the Vratyas, they put pressure on their neighbors, and they have to give them cows for their start capital when they marry. So they play a dice game, a famous dice game, which you can find down to the Mahabharata, but not with cubes, but with 150 nuts. And you must grab an undefined number, and the remnants must be divisible by 4. Then it is auspicious. You say Kruta, Dam, from where you get Kruta, Yuga, etc. You can read all about that in Falk, 1986, unfortunately in German, but you can find some summaries in English as well. So the Kali Graha is, of course, the worst one, from where we get the Kali Yuga. So as I mentioned, some archaeological equivalent of these games has been found in Krasnosamarskoye, that is west of the Urals, near the Urals and the Volga River, for a winter ritual of young men. And so again, here, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics overlap very nicely. This, this Krasnosamarskoye is found here. So west of the Urals, east of the Volga River, excavated over 20 odd years. The yellow here is the Indo-Iranian culture, let us call it like this. Let us leave it at that. So in the Hindu Kush, we get some adopted deities. Actually, the Gandharva is a typical BMSC suffix Rva, as in Atharva, etc. And some fairies, which we call Peri nowadays. They inhabit the high mountain passes and interact with the herders who go up to the mountains in the summer period. And as I said, even the ancient local god Indra, appears as a horse riding New Year visitor, even nowadays with the Kalasha people. You can find a nice summary in Wikipedia. So, and finally the Nagas, yeah? As I mentioned, they bring ice and snow, about which the Kashmir history complains. When they had the upper hand, they were angry and brought ice and snow. So now what kind of Naga is intended here? You can see, you can see this excavated, one-eyed, scaled monster carrying a water mug that has been interpreted by the French archaeologist Frank Four in 1994 as the demon of the drought. Yeah? So when the water is caught up in ice and snow, and there is no rain, of course. That is interpretation, obviously. And this demon is fought by the eagle-headed hero. You can see the human being with eagle head and eagle feet, fighting various demons like the tiger in this case. So this is quite different from the Indian Nagas. This is a very early Naga representation from Tsong near Mathura. So a human being with the hood snakes. So these myths, they have been spread fairly widely. For Indra's, Indra's killing the dragon or great snake is reflected in Europe and far away via the steppes, even in old Japanese myths, but I can't go into details. The same for the horse sacrifice, found in ancient Rome, Ireland, and all along the steppe belt up to northern China and ancient Japan. So these are ancient Indo-European rituals which are preserved in the Ṛgveda. So since I'm well over time, I suppose I will not go into much detail here to sum it up. So the Indian data that we have many overlaps in archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and of course the Vedic text. So which shows obviously the historicity of Vedic text. These are things in the Veda that actually existed, as we can see in the other sciences. So this sustains an emergent picture of the historicity and the origin and spread of the area, their language, poetry, religion, ritual, culture, and even their genetic setup. I have some more details here, but these are summaries of what we have discussed, so I won't go there now in the interest of time. The sum is that India was not isolated in history, prehistory, nor did the many facets which we have discussed of archaeology, linguistic texts, genetic data arise on their own inside the Indian subcontinent. So these are, most of them are not originally Indian. The original Indian data exists separately from those that we have discussed nowadays. So we can look to some 60,000 years of out of Africa history and the early influx into India and then beyond to Southeast Asia, etc. So in some, like other, people usually don't speak like this, like other Asian subcontinents, that is Europe, the once dry Southeast Asian, Indonesia, etc., and Northeast Asia, like those, the Indian subcontinent presents a fascinating array of internal developments and external influences that only patient and unbiased study can reveal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor WITZEL. It was such an enlightening lecture with the PowerPoint presentation. We have started with an analysis of the historicity of the Vedas, which neither the traditionalists who say that Apurshaya Veda or the left or the right would try to agree with. But how beautifully you have approached this subject in an interdisciplinary manner from the archaeological point of view, the linguistic point of view, the genetics and the religion, mythology and the ritual. And you have rightly pointed out, sir, how beautifully this term Aryan is used in the cultural sense and not in the racial sense. How the Persian king Darius used it in 519 BCE. And in the Kaushitiki Aranyaga itself, Arya Vak is used only once there. And even that Harappan motif of a human inside a bird could represent the ancestors who roam around in the ether for 1 year after their departure. That is a very new approach. We have never heard of such a situation. And even the concept of Ratha or the constituents of the Ratha chariot itself, whether it is horse drawn or as in the Sinali chariot, it is bullock cart. And in the linguistics study, how some of the substrate or neglected languages like Kusunda in Nepal or even Nahali in central India, they would throw more light on this theory of the Indo-Aryan migration path and how beautifully you have traced the words in the migration path of Michani, where the money is used for jewel, and Mujavant, where the Soma is obtained, as in the Avesta, the Muza, and how Alexander refers to the Sudroi people on the border of the Sindh and Punjab, corresponding to the Shudra, the term in our Vedic, this one. And then the religion also, you have very beautifully pointed out the Lithuanian usage of Ashvinai for the Ashvinau, the twin gods in the Vedic literature, and how Soma here corresponds to the Avestan Homa. So it is not just confined to India, it is in a way, Aryavarta is more widely spread, and it goes back to even 60,000 years out of Africa. That's very rightly you have said, sir. It is a highly enlightening lecture by you, Professor WITZEL, and we are very much benefited by that, and we are very much beholden to you. We would like to express our sense of gratitude and thanks to you for taking so much of time and delivering this special lecture, the guest of honor. And on behalf of the Kantalu Shala, I wish to profusely thank you